Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Rural Affairs Rural Rapport. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat at any time during the episode. I'll share a little bit, get started here by sharing a little bit about the Center for Rural Affairs. We established in 1973, the center exists to create vibrant rural communities. We do this through small business training and lending, working with communities, farmers and ranchers, and policy change. On today's Rural Rapport, I'm joined by Senior Policy Associate Nathan Beacom and Policy Associates Cody Smith and Heidi Kolbeck-Urlacher to discuss new and updated legislation passed during the 2021 legislative sessions in Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota, aimed at improving the viability of rural communities. During the sessions, lawmakers in all three states approved new legislation and programs to help producers and meat processors clear obstacles brought on by the coronavirus pandemic. In fact, the Nebraska and Iowa bills were passed on the same day. Additionally, lawmakers addressed rural broadband issues, another need highlighted by the global pandemic. Nathan, talk about how Nebraska's new law will support small meat processors and livestock producers.
Yeah, so last year during the pandemic, when the coronavirus started going through meat processing plants, especially in this part of the Midwest, there started to be a big backlog of meat animals and a bottleneck that made it so that producers in some cases had to euthanize their animals, or in other cases didn't have anywhere to send them, and they started trying to go into these smaller meat lockers and smaller independent processing companies. But it became apparent that the infrastructure wasn't there outside of some of these larger plants. And so there ended up being a lot of lost animals, a lot of lost money on the farmer's part. And as people remember, the prices went up at the store and there were shortages and things like that. So that spurred a lot of our states to try to look for alternative routes to make the whole supply chain of meat more resilient and to help out the farmers to have more options and the meat processors to the independent processors, the small processors to expand their business. And so in Nebraska, we helped to craft and pass a piece of legislation that created a program called the Independent Processors Assistance Program, which is a grant program that allows small meat processors to expand their operations or buy new equipment or train their workforce so that there's more of a diverse set of options for where you could buy your meat or where a farmer could take their meat animal. We also started what is called a herd share program. So it allows consumers to own a share in a live animal or animal herd. And because they do that, they can then purchase more directly from a farmer. And so that provides another route for both the customer and the farmer as well. And I know there were some similar bills or bills with similar aims passed in our neighboring states. So we can pass it along to Cody to talk about what they did in Iowa.
Yeah, Cody, lawmakers have also made a commitment to Iowa's small meat processors. What does the new legislation do?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on today, Teresa. It's really exciting to see what happened this legislative session in Iowa and some of the issues and challenges we were able to overcome with the support of many of the center's supporters. In this area, for many of the reasons that Nathan had just mentioned, there was quite a bit of a backlog, leaving farmers with limited, if any, options for getting their livestock processed and really creating this backlog. In fact, some lockers across the state were booking out into 2023, which is just insane compared to the backlog that already was there. The demand was there before, but the coronavirus pandemic really expanded the challenges for producers and small meat processors at the same time. So in Iowa, lawmakers saw this need as well, and the center worked alongside several lawmakers on the House side to help construct a bill that would help alleviate some of these issues. So the center worked with some Republican legislators on the House side to include an amendment in this bill that would make sure that any resources that did get passed would go to meat processors that were small, that were independent, and that were really serving local independent processors as well. So the bill that was passed here was House File 857, it created a butchery innovation and revitalization program. In addition to that program, it also created a task force at the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, consisting of culinary professionals, meat processors, ag leaders, farmers, and a bunch of other folks who could explore the feasibility of creating an artisanal butchery program at a post-secondary educational institution in the state. So a community college, one of the universities governed by the Board of Regents, like Iowa State, University of Northern Iowa, and others. So really looking at what we could do. We were proud to see that that bill ultimately passed and was allocated $750,000 to help support this program that gives low interest or forgivable loans as well as grants to those small meat processors that employ less than 50 employees. So we're excited to see it. I think it's worth noting that this is one of those issues that was so clear and so bipartisan that every vote that it had, including all of the subcommittees, all the committees, each chamber was unanimous. And I think we're really proud to support that type of work in the state.
Heidi, South Dakota has already rolled out its grant program for small meat processors. Talk about that and how that program was received.
Well, thanks, Teresa. In South Dakota, we saw something very similar as to what was passed in Nebraska and Iowa. And this came in the form of a bill brought to the legislature by the Department of Agriculture. And that bill was to appropriate $5 million to create a meats processing capacity grants program that would provide those type of processing plants some funds to make investments in equipment and other types of facilities to ramp up their meat processing. And so this was House Bill 1040, and it passed through the House Agriculture Committee unanimously. But there was a development behind the scenes that the governor actually decided to allocate the funds through coronavirus relief monies that the state had. And so this bill was actually tabled at the request of the Department of Agriculture, and then was basically immediately rolled out following the legislative session in March. They started taking applications, I believe, the middle of March, and then the deadline for that was in May. And just on June 3rd, the awards were issued. The round of awards were issued for that $5 million. And I received an update from the Department of Ag, and they told us that they were able to fund 99 awards with that money. That included 16 new facilities in the state. And all of these awards were for small meat processing facilities, so under 60 employees. And that they actually received requests enough that they could have, in order to fill them all, it would have cost $33 million. So we know that the demand and the need is there for this grants program, and we'll have to see if there's any other funds allocated to this type of work, but definitely the need is there, and really happy and applauding the work of the Department of Ag to get those funds out, and the governor, and already having that turned around those funds is just fantastic to see.
Well, as I said at the beginning, another kind of common topic or common issue addressed in all three states was improving broadband service. This isn't a new topic of discussion, but when more people began working from home and schools began remote learning during the pandemic, the issue seemed to gain more attention and was addressed in all three states. Cody, how is Iowa addressing this issue?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, Teresa. This is really one of those key issues and challenges for rural communities across the state of Iowa. I think many of us who have lived in small towns across the state have experienced slow or unreliable broadband connections. I was excited to see that this year, Governor Kim Reynolds proposed a very historic and kind of sweeping investment in rural broadband expansion in the state. In fact, she proposed $100 million and up to $450 over the next 4 years. What ended up passing this year was House File 848, which was ultimately signed by the governor, and that was an investment of $100 million in rural broadband expansion. What I think is really notable about this program is it allocates those resources based on a set of tiers, and those tiers are defined by the speed of the upload and the download speeds for broadband. So for many folks in rural communities, you maybe have 20 25 megabits per second download, maybe 10 upload. That's actually the federal minimum to be considered broadband. This program really allocates those resources based on who has the slowest speeds across the state and who has the fastest. And eventually, they won't give out any money unless you can do 100 upload and 100 download. So I think that's very significant. It can really help small businesses, farmers, other rural residents and stakeholders really embrace a 21st century economy, helping them power their small business technology or even precision ag tech. So we were really excited to see that this year. Made some suggestions to maybe have a better definition for the word rural, but ultimately we were excited to see this move forward.
Nathan, in Nebraska, like I said, this hasn't been a new discussion item, and this is actually the second session in a row that the issue of rural broadband has been brought to the body in the form of a bill. Last year, a bill was passed, and again this year. So talk about how Nebraska is working to address this issue.
Yeah, a lot of the issues that Cody had mentioned in Iowa, of course, are transferable or analogous to what we have here in Nebraska, especially in some of the more sparsely populated western parts of the state. And what was passed with our support this year at the legislature was Bill LB 388, which is the Broadband Bridge Program. And what that does is designates $20 million in grant funds to areas that are in need of better broadband access. And it utilizes the Broadband Data Improvement Program, which was a program, as you mentioned, passed through a bill, created by a bill last session that was created in collaboration with the center to collect data, better data on where speeds are slower and where the money needs to go. So that'll be a huge benefit, a huge boost this year to those parts of the state.
Heidi, talk about South Dakota, what they're doing as far as improving rural broadband.
Yeah, so this issue came up during our session as well. And there was a bill that was brought forward, Senate Bill 34, and it was brought by request of the Governor's Office of Economic Development to appropriate $100 million towards building out rural broadband infrastructure. And during the testimony for the hearing for this bill, we heard that 135,000 South Dakotans still don't have access to high-speed broadband. So we know this is a really big need. And what we saw was a very high level of support for this bill, and it did pass through. It was amended at one point down to 75 million because the governor allocated $25 million in CARES Act funding to shore up that $100 million investment in rural broadband. And we heard that this is really going to bring South Dakota potentially to the kind of finish line for getting broadband infrastructure out to even those most remote rural areas, those what we heard as frontier areas in South Dakota. So it's really exciting. We're really happy to see this bill come through.
Well, turning to another issue, and another key component of our work here at the center includes preparing and assisting rural communities for a clean energy future. In Iowa and Nebraska, there was some significant action on these priorities. Cody, share some of those developments.
There we go. I found my mute button. I want to start with some inaction, which was really unfortunate. We had been working with a coalition of other groups in the state, including solar developers, other ag groups who really depend on on-farm solar to help cut their costs, and as well as businesses who rely on commercial solar installations to help cut their energy costs and meet their bottom line. Unfortunately, Iowa was in this really weird situation where the state solar tax credit was written to be 50% of the 2013, I believe it was, investment tax credit for solar at the federal level. So what that means is that as that one phased out on that schedule, I think it dropped from 30% to 26 and then further down, folks were getting less and less and less for their state solar tax credit. And ultimately, this year was the year that it was sort of make or break for people who had already purchased their solar energy system and were waiting to receive that tax credit. In fact, that list actually grew to 1,900 Iowans who had bought a solar system and were waiting on their tax credit. we called it the solar tax wait list. And ultimately, the legislature allowed it to expire. We did work on House File 221, which would have remedied that problem, as well as decouple the state tax credit from the federal one. Unfortunately, I think the window really passed on that. And so next year, farmers and business owners and others who really lost access to that resource, they're going to have to contact their legislators, and maybe there's some hope for some retroactive action. But that was unfortunate to see. However, on the positive side, House File 522 was signed by Governor Reynolds last week. And what that does is it empowers livestock farmers across the state of Iowa who are managing their manure to comply with air and water regulations to have another option to do so. And that option would be the use of anaerobic digesters, which can significantly reduce methane emissions from livestock operations, as well as when you put the manure in there to be treated, and even after you take it out and spread it on the surrounding fields or wherever, the nutrient content of that manure is much lower, meaning that less of those nutrients can end up in the state's waterways as opposed to just spreading it in the first place. So that is an important development, I think, for looking at the ag sector in the state and figuring out not only how can we be more climate friendly in our ag industry, but how do we be more strategic about managing our manure for better water quality. So those were two big energy developments this year in the state of Iowa.
Nathan, were there any developments from Nebraska side in this clean energy climate topic?
Yeah, there wasn't a great deal in this legislative session. There were a few ambitious bills that were proposed early on and didn't progress very far. There was a bill passed to include tax incentives for nuclear in the Imagine Nebraska Act, which we were not very active on, but that was something that passed this year. As far as where things are moving, it's more so outside of the legislature. Nebraska, for those outside of the state, has a unique setup where all of its power is publicly owned. All of its utilities are publicly owned. And those utilities, by and large, are making a concerted effort to set plans to totally decarbonize in the coming decades. And so that's really where more of the action is happening than in the legislature. And there seems to be a lot of forward movement in each of the public power districts.
Well, Heidi, in South Dakota, I guess where's clean energy where's clean energy as far as what the legislature has done?
Yeah, so clean energy is definitely a topic that we are very interested in monitoring here in South Dakota, and we work really closely actually with a coalition of other organizations to monitor clean energy action in the state. However, this legislative session was very quiet on that front, so we didn't really see any significant legislation in that area. But right now, we are monitoring a pretty big issue. We think there's been a renewable energy tariff submitted to the Public Utilities Commission that is quite harmful actually to small solar and other distributed generation producers. And so this tariff would particularly affect people out in the Black Hills. It was submitted by Black Hills Energy, so customers of Black Hills Energy would be affected. And what this does essentially is it would require anyone with a small distributed generation system, such as residential solar panels, to sell all of the energy that they produce back to the company for a low rate of about 2.5 cents. And that's the avoided cost rate. And then they would be required to purchase 100% of the energy that they consume, including the energy that they produced off their own system, back from the company at about 12.5 cents, which is the retail rate. So this would really significantly impact the financial feasibility of investing in solar energy for those customers, and it would make the payback time on that investment basically longer than the length of the equipment's life. So that docket is docket EL 21-011. And the Public Utilities Commission is currently accepting public input on that docket. So I would really encourage you, if this is something you are interested in, you can definitely chat with me a little bit more about it, but you can look at the docket as well yourself. There's been creating a lot of buzz, and there's been a lot of public input and comments submitted, and those comments are still open for the public.
Well, great. Thank you guys for that information. We'll kind of talk just kind of generally about some other topics that the legislatures in these respective states talked about. Heidi, we'll stay with you. Share some other things that you were following during the session.
One of the things that we followed was that there was an executive order issued by Governor Nome that would dissolve both the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Natural Resources and combine both of those departments to create a new one department, basically, called the Department of Ag and Natural Resources. And there was a lot of concern from multiple organizations, groups, and citizens about this issue. We were particularly concerned that it would take away some of the focus on agriculture. We really thought that ag producers in this state really needed the attention of a full department to themselves. And so we did oppose, sent out some opposition messaging to our supporters to let them know about this issue and really encourage people to weigh in on this. And there was a Senate resolution of disapproval brought by Senator Troy Harner, and there was a lot of discussion on this. It did pass through the committee. It went to the Senate floor, and had this this resolution passed, it would have blocked the merger. Only one body needed to approve it, and it fell short by one vote, so 18-17. So unfortunately, you know, that's going to move forward, but we have a lot of hope, you know, and we're going to continue to be vocal about you know, advocating for those ag producers out there and making sure that the attention is still there for both them and for the, you know, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So, you know, moving forward, we're just going to continue to monitor, be active, encourage people to do the same. We had another bill that we offered our support to, and that was had to do with home processed foods. And so this bill would have expanded the type of food that would have been sold, as well as the places that home processed foods would have been sold. And it also would have expanded the amount that producers could have made in a year up to $150,000. And, you know, we're very supportive of small food producers and thought this was an opportunity there, but there were some real concerns brought in committee that just couldn't be overcome, kind of around zoning and the amount that people would have been able to sell. So unfortunately, that bill did die in committee, but those are kind of our different areas that we were watching this year.
Well, Nathan, there were some wins, I guess, for rural Nebraskans from the Nebraska legislature this session. Talk about those bills.
Yeah, so we were able to see this year a number of bills that we helped to craft or worked on pass with a great deal of support. And so that LB 324, our meat processing bill, passed without opposition. And another that did was our extension and improvement of the micro enterprise tax credit. And what that is a tax credit targeted specifically to businesses with 5 or fewer employees. And a lot of businesses in the rural parts of the state fall into that category. And this is the only benefit or incentive from the state targeted towards those smallest businesses. And so that tax credit was doubled from a $10,000 maximum to a $20,000 maximum, and the program was extended 10 years. And there were a few changes that made it kind of more straightforward about applying and who can apply and things like that. And so that was seen kind of across the board as a win for rural areas by the legislature. And so it's passed, and that will be going into effect in August. Another very popular bill was the bill to create a farm to school network in the state. And farm to school are programs that source the food that kids get at school from local farms. And so this network will now have a director in the State Department of Education who will be responsible with making those connections between schools and farmers. And that's good because it provides this market, this extra kind of source of revenue for local farmers, and it builds up the local economy. And then it also gets that healthy, fresh Nebraska food onto Nebraska school kids' plates. And at the same time, they get to learn more about where their food comes from and what that's all about. And then another one that I wanted to mention. We had quite a few successful bills, but I'm just kind of trying to hit the high points. Another one I wanted to mention was LB 108, which was a bill to improve the SNAP program, which used to be called food stamps in the state. And that bill solves what's called the cliff effect in SNAP. And what that is that after you start making a certain amount of money, it's 130% of the federal poverty level. So that would be if you were a family of 4 and you made $27,000 a year. Once you started making more than that, you wouldn't be able to receive any benefits anymore, but you also wouldn't make enough to replace the benefit that you lost. And so that has kind of a negative incentive where it could cause people, and I spoke to a number of people who this was the case, cause people to turn down a raise or turn down a new job because they would lose enough money to feed their family. And so ourselves and other folks in the state thought it would be better if people could sort of taper off of that SNAP benefit as they get into a position where they can have their own stability and become more self-sufficient. And so that bill raised that income eligibility cap to 165%. And I could say more about the bill, but it had broad support, bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats, urban and rural. And at the end of the day was vetoed by the governor, but there was enough support across the board that it passed, notwithstanding the governor's objections. And so we know we can say with confidence that this will help thousands of working families in Nebraska. And many of those families are rural. So those are all some of the good wins to see this year in the state for rural parts of Nebraska.
Thanks, Nathan. Cody, what are some of the other issues that you kept your eye on during the Iowa session?
Yeah, I'm going to start with, again, a good news, bad news scenario. So on the good news front, one of the key issues of the Center for Rural Affairs that we really advocate and spend a significant amount of resources to help elevate the voices of rural Iowans in the dialogue about is water resources management. So that includes both flood mitigation and water quality improvement. There were a number of discussions about this issue this year related to a couple of different bills, but 2 of them are ones I wanted to focus on. So the first one is, as I mentioned, the good news part. House File 523 actually redefined flood mitigation activities as an essential county purpose in state code. What that means is it gives county supervisors more resources and more tools to be able to implement flood mitigation projects within their jurisdiction. I believe if you get into the technical details about it, it makes it a little bit easier to bring bond votes before the voters of the county to be able to finance flood mitigation projects. So we were excited to see county officials have more tools in their toolbox for addressing flooding. As we know, that is a huge issue, not just here in Iowa, but in the other states that we're talking about today. And we were excited to see that move forward. That was signed by the governor as well. And the other thing we worked on that unfortunately didn't move forward this year, but I think is worth noting because it had clear bipartisan support and grassroots support across the state. And that was our watershed advancements that enhance resources pilot program, or water pilot program. What that would have done was offer 3 3-year grants of $300,000 apiece to eligible watershed management authorities to staff a watershed coordinator. Those were a lot of words. Essentially, all what we were trying to do is to give state support for locally directed voluntary watershed partnerships that are called watershed management authorities. They include 3 groups: cities, counties, and soil and water conservation districts. They're organized along the boundaries of a watershed instead of political boundaries like a county line. And they implement flood mitigation and water quality projects in conjunction with farmers, landowners, and other city and local governments. We were very close to getting that introduced in the House, and I think we will continue that advocacy in the years to come. But we were kind of disappointed not to see that move forward. However, we do think there is a lot of momentum and clear bipartisan support for it. So looking forward, we'll continue to work on water quality and flood mitigation and encourage anybody who may be interested in learning more about the work we're doing to reach out.
Well, as I look back on the session and observing it, one of the big things I noticed, and I've heard from various representatives and lawmakers, is they like to hear from the people. They like to hear from the constituents on these issues. And during a pandemic year, obviously, a lot of issues have surfaced. And I think a lot more people have been willing to kind of speak out on how this has affected them, whether they're a small business owner or, a farmer. And in a lot of cases, small meat processors, those were big kind of issues during this session. Can each of you share a little bit about the advocacy, the support we received, or the support or the interaction amongst constituents with their lawmakers this session?
Absolutely. Thanks for giving us that space. One of the things I've been thinking about over the last year is that, if anything, the COVID pandemic has shown us how much our government is present in our lives, from everything from going out to eat, and then also, water and energy and all of these other things. I think that really encouraged a lot of folks to get involved this year. And I'm happy to say, and I've got a list here, just looking at, our recap. Our supporters sent 165 different emails to state lawmakers about issues that we've discussed today, including meat processing and water and energy. We were able to work with more than almost 24 small meat processors and farmers across the state of Iowa to bring their messages of support for House File 857, the meat processing bill that passed, forward to talk with their senators, with their representatives about why this was needed. And I do think that played a huge role in making sure that we got a unanimously approved and signed by the governor. So I was excited to see that level of interaction. Overall, over the last 2 years, we've met with about 38 state lawmakers as the center to bring those voices and those stories from rural Iowans forward. And I think this year was really notable that we registered on 44 bills, and of those 44, 23 passed in one form or another. And so that is, of the 23 that we supported, all but 3 passed there too. And that is just, something that is directly attributable to the amount of interaction that we had this year. And we were excited to meet new people, hear new stories, and we'll continue to do that in the years to come, and encourage folks who may have worked with us this year to continue to reach out and bring their friends along next time too.
Nathan, there were many folks that went to the public hearings hosted by committees in Nebraska to speak up on the topics of meat processing, microenterprise. Talk about that support and during the session.
Yeah, so we spoke to every small meat processor that we could find in the state. We called them up and had a conversation, and many of those were supportive of our bill, and so they were able to come and participate and speak directly to legislators, to write letters, to do phone calls. So that was great to see, both in learning from meat processors and cattle producers too, what they needed, and then to have them participate in the creation of the ideas and in bringing that bill through to passage. Likewise, we talked to economic development directors in small towns and small businesses, and chambers of commerce and accountants on our tax credit bill for those small businesses. And on SNAP, we talked to folks who work at food banks, grocery store owners, people who had been on SNAP and were able to get on their feet afterwards, and why that was important to them. And those voices are important to the legislators, to hear from people who are their own constituents, who they're accountable to, and who it's their job to help, is really very meaningful. And so, like Cody said, that's a huge part of why these bills are successful. And as we look forward to doing more of the same in the next session and making more connections. And in Nebraska, there's kind of a saying, we only have one house in our legislature, that the people themselves are the second house, and that really is the case. And so we appreciate all those people who helped get those bills passed this year.
I've definitely heard that saying as well, and it's kind of one of the uniquenesses about Nebraska. Heidi, share a little bit about the support in South Dakota.
Yeah, so our legislative work in South Dakota is kind of new. And so just over the last couple of years, we started to monitor what's going on in the legislature here and kind of really track and follow those bills. We've been working really diligently to engage with other organizations who are interested in the same issues as us and kind of building up those coalitions and involvement. And then just last year, we launched a newsletter, the peer review that we send out to our supporters. And we do that every 2 weeks, recapping bills that we're watching, kind of giving our analysis and input on those, encouraging people really to reach out and engage with the legislature. It's very easy, simple to do, and those legislators really want to hear from people. So we try to keep those South Dakota supporters engaged, and I would encourage anybody from South Dakota who's watching this, go to our website and sign up for a newsletter and make sure that we get you on our peer review list for next year, because we are really trying to expand our involvement, engagement, and on those important issues to rural South Dakotans. And each year, we're watching some more and building relationships with people out there.
Well, great. Yes, we are always in need of advocates to speak up for rural America. So if you want to learn more about how you can get involved, go over to our website. It's cfra.org/advocate. That's the page. You can learn more. We keep that up to date. If we have an email that we've sent out asking folks to take action on a certain issue, it'll be on there. But you can certainly go on there to find out how you can get involved. Contact one of our staff and we'll answer any questions you might have. Thank you guys for joining me today. I think this is some great information. Definitely some wins this year and some work still left to do, but I think that keeping, working with our legislators to do things that promote rural America is great. So thank you everybody for joining us today. As a reminder, you can visit our website at cfra.org, or you can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, where we continually share resources that we develop and promote events that we are hosting. Please join us back here live next Tuesday for another Rural Report. Have a good day, everyone.